These stories are first-hand accounts shared by Reddit users, detailing unsettling real-life encounters that left lasting impressions. Each narrative provides a chilling glimpse into moments of danger, survival, and eerie coincidences that might make you rethink your surroundings. Disclaimer: these accounts were originally published by Reddit users and are presented as personal experiences. While they are described as true events, their accuracy relies on the original storytellers. The details shared here are intended for awareness and cautionary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. Story 1. Night Vision. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday and he'd left them at my apartment. One night I was bored and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area/nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a very stupid idea since I was all by myself and female, but I was young and stupid and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign "Park closes at 10" and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I'd found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with the mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary and I put it down to animal activity, hopefully the deer I'd come hoping to see. After I'd hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or no, if I sat right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this: a man, dressed head to toe in dark-colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind was prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I'd had one I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who, or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car, if he'd circled back and seen my parked car, alone in the lot. If he'd come in after me. I sat, paralyzed with fear, and watched the man for what felt like forever but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree and I was sure he was going to look up and find me, but he didn't. After a while he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Fuck it," and he started heading back in the direction he'd come, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down and, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp. Presumably, a giant knife that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me, and thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. Creepy forest rapist, let's never meet again. Edit. To answer some of the questions I've gotten in the comments and PMs, I did call the police once I got back home. 2 very nice cops came to my apartment and took a report, and that was unfortunately the last I heard of it. Which from what I've seen on this sub is fairly typical, bummer though that is. Story 2. The worst experience of my life. Before I start, I know a lot of people come here and say, this is 100% true, etc., and half the time it seems as though they've lied. I will go to say what you're about to read is real. The events happened and I still to this day don't understand it and do not expect you to either. Theories and possible explanations are highly welcomed. I work in a well-known clothing retail store in the UK. I am not allowed to say which store or company, as in my contract I am permitted to talk about the company in what could be perceived as a negative way, and I work in the stockroom as part of the delivery or stock team. About 2 or 3 weeks before Christmas 2014, maybe in between, I had asked my store manager if I could work some overtime to get more money for Christmas presents, and she thought this was a smart move as my stockroom manager was out of the country on holiday for a week visiting family also. Nearing Christmas the deliveries get pretty big, almost 3 times the size of regular deliveries, so there was the work available for me to come in and complete. It would involve stripping clothes from packets and hanging them within the stockroom. My manager had asked that rather than come in on a day I don't usually work, I work there part-time, that I should instead stay for additional hours past my contracted ones, which meant that I had to lock up. My manager trusted me to do this as I've worked there for almost 3 years now, so she handed me her master key. The only other master key was with my stockroom manager who was currently out of the country. This is where it begins. The time was nearing to around 8 p.m. at night. All of my colleagues had left the building and I had locked the door after them, turned off the store music and secured the bottom loading bay, where the deliveries come in. I was in the stockroom on the 2nd floor putting some hangers on the rack so that I could use them for the next delivery. I was standing underneath a puppy teddy stuffed between a pipe and a wooden piece of racking facing me. I'll post a picture. The teddy was an old toy from a delivery that was left behind and my colleagues had given it a name. The name I can't remember because the teddy isn't really spoken of much, it just sits there. My iPod was plugged into a pair of speakers that had been in the stockroom ever since, only small things, and I was happily completing my task. Happily until I heard a noise. Yes, that might sound cliché, but this noise was very familiar to my ears and it was the noise of the bottom loading bay shutters being opened. I thought someone must be in the store as the only way to open and shut them is from a panel next to them, from the inside. So I paused my music and proceeded to walk down the stairs out back to the bottom loading bay. It was when I was about halfway down the noise suddenly stopped. What I can say that always creeps me out about the place is that the lighting around the corridors, staircases and stockrooms were lit up by strip lights. I'll post a picture. And these strip lights had sensors on them, so whenever you walked under one you'd hear a small click and it would come on. So there I was gliding down the stairs, click click click. I burst into the loading bay expecting to see one of my colleagues, but lo and behold it was empty. The shutters were shut. I embraced a shudder down my spine and simply spun around and paced back to my workstation in the stockroom. I illuminated the strip lights and konnichied to hang some more hangers, the music from my iPod playing along calming my nerves, until I remembered, I turned my iPod off. I spun around horrified and just stared at my iPod over on the shelf. As I took a breath and shook my head I caught a glimpse. A glimpse of where the teddy should have been sitting. I was drenched with panic and took a step back to look further down the stockroom, about a 100-yard stretch where I had suspected a culprit had fled only to face darkness. I stood for a moment, still bewildered by what had just unfolded when I heard a faint click. I instantly moved to my right to get a good look down the stockroom, but yet I still faced darkness. Click, click, was all I heard, gradually getting louder, closer. This is when Pavlov's theory kicked in and I realized no lights were switching on in sync with the click, no lights switched on at all. I turned to the door to see my only exit route, then spin my head round back to be greeted with a dark figure in the distance. The figure was big, what I can only describe as perhaps a bodybuilder male that I need glasses for long-distance things and usually only wear them in the cinema or at football games anyway. The darkness didn't help. Within his hand I could see a small object, although when the hand clutched at it I could make out that it was the teddy. This is when I felt adrenaline scream run. Out of the stockroom, down the corridor, through 2 doors and to my right straight into the ladies' toilets, opposite the 2 offices. I ran straight into one of the 4 cubicles, the middle one, and locked myself in. I crouched on the toilet, crouched and shaking, partly because I'm a tall guy and partly because my heart was hammering in my ears, putting my balance off. The doors of the toilet took a while to close, slowly as they should, and listened out for anybody to be approaching. The doors shut, which gave me little relief, and I stopped and blinked, thinking for a moment. I wiped the sweat off my brow with my left forearm. As my head turned to meet my arm, I glanced down at the bottom of the cubicle. That a face was there. A face was pulling away from underneath just as I caught a glimpse of the mouth and nose. My only description is that the teeth were black and seemed slightly bloody from a self-inflicted wound, and by the grayish skin tone and wrinkles the person was old. I was injected with pure fear when I screamed, "Fuck off," and kicked at the door, making it shake and slam, echoing around the walls in a thunder. I swung the door, looked back, took a deep breath and braced myself before darting out of the toilets and to the front of the store. I was charging along, prepared to attack anything to save myself from injury, yet nothing stood between me and the front door. I unlocked it with shaking hands and ran outside. I knew I had left my coat and iPod inside, but I was eager to get out. Locking the sliding doors behind me, I span to the shutter lock on the wall. It's located at the bottom of the wall. For this reason I am unsure of, it's always been a hassle for people. I turned the key inside the lock and the shutters were descending. The store shutters were on the inside of the store, just past the alarms, and as I crouched there slowly watching the shutters come down, again I witnessed the figure, still holding the teddy, in the middle of the shop floor. It was dark outside and it was dark inside at this point. The shop floor lights are different and have to be switched on in the office. I closed my eyes and begged the shutter to hurry as it hit the floor, and I snatched the key away and ran down the road to the high street. My phone was in my pocket where it's always kept, so I called the police and told them what happened. I told them I believed a male had broken in. The police arrived shortly and I let them into the store. I had them escort me to the office to turn the lights on, and as I reached the office I noticed the computer was on. I told them this wasn't on before, but they sped me up to turn the lights on so that they could search the store. After touring them around the store to search, even the lift, they found nobody and told me to go home. The officers had said that they would contact my manager tomorrow. The next day I arrived at work at opening time, even though I wasn't scheduled to work. I was greeted by different officers from the night before and my store manager. We proceeded to go to the office just after my manager had opened the store and let my colleagues set up. The officers had said that they would continue a search that day and night again, and that my manager should ask for CCTV to be installed. The reason our store doesn't have cameras is because the theft rate isn't high enough to have them. Apparently. We all think that's dumb, then again we get away with messing around sometimes. I walked to the stockroom to get my iPod and coat before leaving when one last stab of fear yanked my heart to my boots when I glared at the teddy, stuffed back into its usual space. I was allowed 2 contracted days off that week to rest. I think my manager thought I was seeing things and needed to sort myself out. I returned to work as usual. I was happy to do so as it was within the daytime and the store was full with people. Nothing has happened since. I still don't know how it was possible or what happened, if it was a prank, if someone/people had a motive. Some people think I'm crazy, some think it might be a group. Tell me what you think. It was the worst experience of my life. Story 3. Tape recorder. My friend suggested I share my story here, and I finally have the time to type it out. I don't know if this exactly meets the standards of this outlet, but it definitely is the scariest experience I've ever had. Here goes. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As I am now 21 and live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while. But it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child and my father worked in another province months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late-night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forest. This night I was exploring said woods. I usually never went too far in, usually up to a large rock formation I liked to climb and look out through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound from further in, a sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying, faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help, but then I worried that the girl would wander further in beyond earshot. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was in. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all of this was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind. Just non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that had only a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far before, so this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder, one of the biggest I had ever seen, was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had went all this way expecting to find a real person. But it was only a tape recorder? As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady steps, advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees I identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try listening to see if that person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting all of the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest shadows. But nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also never was able to go back into that forest again. Story 4. In the hills, no one can hear you cry. This is actually my stepmom/her best friend's story. I have my own, but I'm so hesitant to drag some of them up. I'm hoping telling someone else will open me to it a little more. My stepmom didn't like us much, but she told my sister, 3 years older, and I this experience growing up to scare us out of being stupid. It was my family's stranger danger story. My stepmom, we're going to call her Macy, Grew up as a kind of a privileged teen in the 70s, and her mom had moved their family over here, the States, from England when she was about 9. She went to a pretty nice high school in a really nice town. There, she made friends with a girl, Lily, who didn't exactly run with Macy's type of crowd, popular, stereotypical, etc. They really hit it off, and Lily would take Macy out to do her type of stuff, hiking, fishing, sailing. There's even a hilarious set of pictures of them camping. My stepmom has raccoon eyes and looks like she hates everything. Anyways, because of Lily's influence, the two of them would do stuff like that a good amount. One Sunday they decided to go hike in some hills about an hour away. Macy put on what I'm sure were her extremely expensive hiking shoes, and the two of them drove off to the hiking trails. Lily parked in this big clearing with makeshift parking spots, like a piece of wood marking the head of a space, but there were no other cars there. This was only important in hindsight. They started hiking up the hill, off the path, because Lily fancied herself as something of a badass. The hike was nothing extraordinary. If you asked my stepmom, she would just lament for 15 minutes how sticky and buggy it was. Anyways, they reached the top of the hill and my stepmom was done. The polished, pampered side of her was coming out and she groaned until Lily, begrudgingly, said okay. They would rest and then walk down again, slower. They had been heading down the hill for maybe 10 minutes when Macy started bitching again. Lily conceded to walking down the side of the road instead of the rough hiking trail. So there they are, probably looking like a couple of tools geared up for hiking and walking down a crappy road, and after not even 5 minutes, a truck pulled up next to them. It was red and rusty, and just generally looked like a clunker. The guy driving rolled down the window and the girls looked in through the passenger's side window. He had a big beard, a baseball cap pulled down, and long brown hair. He greeted them and even smiled through his beard, asking if they needed a ride. Macy described him as charming and even cute. Lily still says the moment he greeted them her hackles went up. Despite her better judgment, my stepmom convinced her to get in the truck. It must only be a 10-minute drive down to the car, tops. The two girls opened the passenger's door to this rusty old thing, and the guy directed them behind the seat to get into the back. They settled in and the truck started rumbling forwards. Lily always says that was the point it hit her what a mistake they had just made. The back seat was clean enough, but there was a rope on the floor behind the driver's seat and 4 boxes of saran wrap half hanging out from under the passenger's seat. It seemed creepy and weird, but Lily didn't want to freak my stepmom out, so she just kept her mouth shut. After 10 minutes, the woods didn't look any clearer, and they hadn't seen another car the whole time. Lily asked how long he thought it would be. He said he was taking a different route down the hill and had to stop somewhere to get something first. That was it. The girls were 16-17, and Lily didn't want to press the issue. She was scared. She can remember his hair because she was sitting behind him. He looked like a woodsy guy, but his hair was super tangled and dirty. She noticed crusted mud on his collar and tried to find something identifiable about him, but just got scared the more she picked up on little details. He was youngish, strong-looking, and had a 1 foot on both of them. So they didn't ask any more questions, and he didn't offer any information, and they drove on. Several minutes after that, they reached a tiny shack/log cabin-looking place right there in a clearing of trees. There was an old stump where someone had been chopping wood and a huge axe stuck into the log. Lily was definitely on red alert now. The guy turned off the truck and slipped out of it, saying, "I'll be right back. Don't get out." And he disappeared into the house. Lily tried to talk to my stepmom about how she was incredibly uncomfortable, but she mostly just dismissed it. Lily started begging, increasingly freaked out, and finally put her foot down, demanding Macy exited the truck with her. So they got out and walked around the front of the vehicle. The house was about 50 yards in front of them. Why this guy would have left 2 young girls in the truck alone while going into the house is beyond me, and they wandered around looking at it hesitantly. If this guy really was decent and just trying to give them a ride, it would be super rude to just run off, right? My stepmom had this strict upbringing when it came to manners and a public persona, and she saw it as an issue of that nature. So she actually started to head back to the truck, opening the front door to climb in behind the driver's seat. Lily was pissed off and followed her to yell some more. On the driver's side floor, half hidden under the seat, there was a big hatchet. It had dried red/brown stains covering the blade and stuck to the floor under it. Lily understandably lost her shit, and seeing it, my stepmom started getting hysterical. They decided that leaving was by far their best option at this point, and just booked it off the side of the property into the trees. They bumbled around in the trees for a little while until Lily was fairly confident they were on their way back down the hill. My stepmom cried all the way down. Lily felt bad about it, but was also completely freaked out that he would hear it and kept trying to calm her down. When they finally got back down to the bottom and saw the old wooden fence that surrounded the original parking area, they were relieved. But as they got closer they saw it. It was parked on the other side of the gravelly makeshift lot. Just sitting there, facing the other way innocently. They couldn't see if anyone was in it, and of course Macy wanted to run for the car, but Lily was super hesitant. She managed to calm my stepmom down, saying she wanted to wait before running out into the open to see what was out there. Remember, this is the 70s. No cell phones. There was no ranger station or anyone around. The parking lot was big and empty and open, and who knows what would have happened if they decided to stroll across it. Thankfully, Lily convinced my stepmom to chill, and the two of them hunkered down against a big tree, hidden by bushes and other trees, and waited it out for what seemed to be a couple of hours, when dark started to fall. All the animals started coming out and making noises, and my stepmom, predictably, started getting antsy about this and bothering Lily, who was tired and moments away from giving in. She was just planning their dash to the car when they heard a clunk. Across the twilight-lit lot, they watched as one of the back doors of their car swung open. And the bearded guy slid his way out of the back seat. He got out, shut the door, looked around at the surrounding woods for several moments, and then walked back to his truck. The truck lumbered past their car and out of sight. Several minutes after watching him drive away, they sprinted to their car as fast as they could, jumped in, and peeled out before they had even shut the doors. If this guy is still alive, he's really old, but still, let's just not meet. Story 5. Dark House in the Woods. I've had a few scary encounters in my life. Not sure if that means that I'm old or just a creep magnet, but this one still creeps me out. In the early 80s, when I was 8, my family was visiting my uncle who lived in backwoods Missouri. He lived on a lot of land, and the only other people who really even lived on the street were relatives, so no one else ever just happened to be out there. This meant no one ever locked their doors, because random family members were always coming by for this or that. One night while we were there, my parents, aunt, and uncle decided to go to a nearby town to go bowling, because bowling. My brothers, who were 11 and 12, my female cousins, 6 and 14, and I'm female, stayed home. It was still daylight when the adults left, but it started raining pretty hard and got dark quickly. We used to play this game that was essentially hide and seek in the dark house, but we cleverly called it vampire. There was a thin little mattress on the living room floor that some of the kids would sleep on at night, so the person who was it would lie on the mattress and fold it over themselves like a coffin and count down to midnight. When they got to midnight, they went looking for you. Again, all of the lights are off, and you tried to make it back to the coffin before you got caught. Because the house was in the country, it was pitch black at night, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. What this meant for the game was that 1, you couldn't tell where the vampire was looking, so you just had to make a break for it, and 2, if you were extremely lazy, and I'm sure by now you can guess which one of us met those standards, you could hide in the living room with the coffin and get to base quickly. Ben, my 11-year-old brother, was it, and was doing the normal countdown. I was hiding maybe 6 feet from him. As he's counting, there's a flash of lightning. I don't know if I was already looking at the living room window or if the lightning made me look, but with the backlight of the lightning, I see a man with his face against the window. He had his hands on each side of his face as if he's trying to peer in, and looks exactly like the stereotypical creeps. Heavy-set, scraggly beard, etc. I could feel every hair on my body standing on end. Immediately, I began trying to convince myself that I didn't see what I saw, but then Ben sternly whispered, "If anyone is hiding in here, stay still." I sort of croaked out an, "I'm here," right as there was another flash of lightning. Creepster was still there, but was no longer trying to look in the window. Instead, he was now looking toward the front door. Ben and I immediately knew what was coming next. From where he was standing, Creepster was probably only 5 feet from the front door. Ben was the same distance, but there was a couch between him and the door. Ben leapt over the couch and locked the door right as Creepster started trying the handle. At this point, I guess Ben decided that it was best to let Creepster know that people were home and that we knew he was there, because he flipped on the porch light and then started turning on the lights in the house. This is going to sound weird, but I was too terrified to panic. Having said that, I was relying completely on Ben to know and tell me what to do. He told me to go lock the other doors and was yelling for everyone else to come out and to lock all of the windows. Honestly, the next few minutes are hazy in my mind. I remember everything up until this point extremely clearly, then I remember the end very clearly, but I'm less clear about the middle. I know that I locked the side door and then the sliding glass door on the back of the house. When we've talked about it over the years, some people remember us seeing him out the back door as well. I don't think I remember that. What I clearly recall is locking the sliding glass door and standing there frozen and hearing Ben, in a very calm but firm voice, say, "Close the curtain. Listen to me, okay? Close the curtain." So I did. Ben can't remember that part and I just remember my fear and Ben's voice, so I'm not sure if I saw Creepster in the backyard or not. We tried to call the police, but my aunt and uncle had a stupid party line and it wouldn't work, whether from the storm or from a neighbor leaving it off the hook or whatever. For the record, they are the only people I've ever known with a party line, so this wasn't normal to me either, but for those of you who don't know what that is, in really rural areas, multiple people on the street would actually share a phone line. It would have different rings for different households, but you could pick up the phone and listen to your neighbor's conversation. We also tried to summon help on my uncle's CB radio, but couldn't reach anyone. My uncle was a hunter, so he had a gun rack full of rifles in his room, but my older cousin was on an out-of-town hunting trip and took them with him. All we could find was a BB gun that looked like a real rifle. I vividly remember Ben putting me on phone duty and Scott, my older brother, on CB duty, while he stood watch at the little square window on the front door with the BB gun. Maybe 30 minutes later, Ben said, "He's back. He's coming up the driveway." The rest of us froze in fear, but Ben opened the front door and stepped out on the porch, pointed the gun, and said, "Get out of here right now." Then we hear our cousin Kyle, who lived down the road a bit, say, "You know that's a BB gun, right?" Even though Kyle was only 15, I remember that we felt like we had been saved when he showed up. Kyle seemed really skeptical of our story, like we were playing a trick on him, even though we had no idea that he was coming, but he stayed with us until our parents came home. Honestly, I don't remember if we even told our parents what happened when they got home. There was definitely no police involvement though, we just went on with our trip. But we never played vampire again without some mention of that night. Edit, I just talked to Ben. First, he doesn't have an account, but is so pleased that everyone thinks he handled himself well. Second, he said the story was pretty spot on to how he remembers it, but that the guy was at the back door. When we talked about it before, I thought he didn't remember that part, so I was confused on that. He said that as I was locking the side door, we saw Creepster moving around to the back of the house, so Ben told me to hurry and lock the sliding glass door. Those doors are right around the corner from each other, so I was closest. According to Ben, and this is what I thought happened, but I didn't want to say it unless I was positive, as soon as I flipped the lock on the back door, the guy was standing there, just looking in at me. I just stood there for a couple of beats looking at him, and that's when Ben told me to close the curtain. We also saw him in the front yard one more time after that. I remembered this all along, but wanted to check with Ben to make sure he also remembered it before I added it in. It was a large front yard with a long gravel driveway. Off to one side of the driveway, quite a ways from the house, was a spot where my cousins parked cars they were working on. I know, so stereotypical. While we were on watch, we saw Creepster messing with one of the cars. It was actually Kyle's. When he couldn't get it started, he walked into the woods that ran beside the house. We didn't see him again after that. Story 6. Burning Recliner and Dead Cow. Hey guys, new here so be gentle. I actually have several stories to share if you're interested, all true and all creepy. I'll start with this particular story because it haunts me to this day, over 20 years after it happened. I was about 21 or 22 when this happened. I was in the military at Footsill and didn't know it, but Desert Storm was right around the corner. At the time, I lived in south-central Oklahoma on the outskirts of a small town called Duncan. I was helping a friend round up some cattle that got out because someone had run across a T-section and went through their fence. It tore 2 posts down and left a 30-foot section open for the cattle to get out. We'd already found most of the cattle and were missing another 3 or 4, so we were out at 1 a.m. on dirt bikes trying to find them before someone hit one of them and sued his father. My friend and I went east and the other guys went north and south. One thing you need to understand about Oklahoma is that most of it farmed, either cattle or crops. It is also divided into 1-mile sections for the most part. In other words, the roads all run north and south or east and west and intersect at 1-mile intervals. If you ask directions for something out in the country, you are more likely than not to get instructions that include, go 3-mile sections north and then 2-mile sections west. The area at this time was sparse and there weren't many homes. We didn't know how long the hole had been in the fence. My friend's father only checked the fence because he was missing livestock. They own the entire mile section and a good portion of the adjoining mile section. The hole in the fence was on the east side of their land, at the furthest distance from their house. They checked the fence for such holes on a weekly basis, so the hole could not have been more than 2 days old. James and I were riding on these old dusty, dirt roads with battery-powered spotlights to both show the way and to search for cattle. We'd stop at any of the million small wooden bridges and look to see if there were any cows down by the water. Our plan was to go out 10 miles and then go over a mile section and drive back 10 miles until we'd gone a total of 10 miles out and 10 miles over. Then we were to do it all again but on the north/south roads instead of the east/west roads. If you were to plot it on a map, it would be a 10 by 10 grid. We had been at it since before 9 p.m., just as it was getting dark and we'd already gone 10 miles out and about 3 miles over. I need to mention at this point that there are some mile sections that are not divided by roads and you have to turn one way or another at a T intersection. If that happens, we always take the road that goes in our general direction of travel. If we were traveling east and came to AT, and we'd already checked the road north of us, then we'd head to the south a mile and then head east again. Occasionally, an old farmer would pass away and leave his land to relatives who had no interest in farming and the land would be put up for sale or just left alone for years. When this happens and the roads aren't used as much, nature reclaims them and you're usually left with a dirt road with weeds and grass growing on it or you're left with little more than an improved trail, usually 2 ruts with overgrown weeds and Johnson grass and occasionally a tree. We were on one of the rutted roads, headed south to the next intersection where we'd turn east again. The land here was too hilly for cultivation and had been left alone for at least the last 30 years. We were both familiar with it and we hunted and fished there. This mile section and the next 2 were basically wild. At the end of the dirt trail would be AT intersection, but the west side was fenced and the only option was to turn east again. At the end of this mile section, the road was a dead end, but we had to check it and double back. We just made the turn back to the east when we saw something burning over the next rise. Grass fires are extremely dangerous and can get out of control in minutes. As we topped the rise, we saw that the fire was actually in the middle of the dirt road. When we got to it, we found that it was a recliner that was burning. A blue Lazy-Boy recliner. We stopped and threw some dirt on it and finally got it extinguished. James and I were wondering what kind of an idiot would do this and how strange it was to be in the middle of the road just burning. Satisfied that the fire was out, we got back on our bikes and idled past the recliner toward the end of the mile section, still a quarter of a mile in the distance. We found one of their cows at the bottom of the rise, about 100 feet down the road. It was laying half in and half out of the road. Its throat had been cut and it was laying there with its eyes open and tongue hanging out. There was blood everywhere. As we were looking at it and trying to figure out what happened, James said, "Hey, look at this," and showed me where the blood had dripped from the cow to about 10 feet away from it. There were shoe prints of blood in the road. It was just part of a shoe print, but you could tell that it was a shoe print. We found 2 more when we looked more diligently. At this point, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up and it was suddenly a very cool evening. I looked at James and his eyes were as big as saucers. He thought something spooky was happening too. We talked about going back, but we knew that we'd be shamed if we didn't see if there was anything else. We finally decided to walk the bikes the rest of the way to the dead end just in case there was someone there. We didn't want them to hear the engines. We began walking the last quarter mile or so to the dead end. It was at the base of the last hill and we just started heading up it on the other side. My heart was going about 200 miles an hour and I had a cotton mouth so bad that it was almost impossible to swallow. Then I noticed that someone had stuck paper plates to the barbs of the wire of the fence. We looked and there were plates stuck to the top strand of wire on both sides of the road. It started about 50 feet behind us and continued up and over the hill. They were evenly spaced about 5 feet apart. As our gaze followed the row of paper plates up to the top of the hill, James suddenly said, "There's another fire," and it was at that moment that I could smell it. But what I smelled wasn't that normal smoky smell, it was as though someone had added incense to it. I asked James if he could smell that and he could. I told him that I didn't like this at all. I was okay with losing face in front of our friends and his dad and brothers. I was ready to go. He agreed with me but said that we had to see what was burning. We were both whispering and we were both shaking so much that our voices quavered. We started up the hill again and I was thinking with every step that we were going to be seriously killed or worse. As we got to the top of the hill, one of the paper plates blew off the fence and skittered behind us, making both of us jump, and it was all I could do not to scream. After we saw what it was, I started to laugh it off, but James shushed me and told me to listen. We could hear voices. As we topped the hill and were able to see the bottom where the road stopped, we saw a group of about 10 people all standing around another recliner that was burning. They had their backs to us and they were passing a big pitcher around. From our vantage point, we couldn't actually see what was in the pitcher, but the slit throat of the cow haunted my thoughts. They would each take a mouthful and spit it into the fire. This went on until the pitcher was empty. The entire time, they were all saying something in unison. We could only understand an occasional word. They changed their tones in a rhythmic manner with an emphasis on the last word. I can remember hearing here and there, and beseech, and father. James and I stood there on top of that hill like a couple of idiots. Our mouths were hanging wide open and actually scared stiff. After a minute or two, they would repeat whatever it was, all the while passing that pitcher and spitting into the fire. There was a small camp table set up on the side and little behind them. After the last of the liquid was gone, a man turned and sat the pitcher on the table and picked up what looked like a large loaf of bread. Just as he was turning back to the fire, he evidently saw us. I am sure that we made a nice silhouette sitting there at the top of the hill. He screamed, "Hey!" and dropped the loaf of bread and started running in our direction. The others turned and immediately followed him. That was all the encouragement that we needed. It was time to go. We turned our bikes around. James got his start on the first kick, but I somehow managed to get myself off balance, and when I kicked, the bike fell on its side with me. By this time I was near panic and was breathing in raspy short breaths. I picked the bike up again and tried to start it, but it didn't start. I thought about running, but we were out in the middle of nowhere. I finally started pushing the motorcycle down the other side of the hill and jumped on it. It seemed like it took forever to get enough speed, but I popped the clutch and it started. James was waiting at the corner of the intersection to make sure that I was coming, and we headed for his house, going way too fast for safety, especially in the dark. When we finally got back to his house, we told his dad what we'd seen. His dad called a couple friends and they all loaded up in their trucks with enough weapons to start a small war. James and I sat with his dad and told him where to turn. His dad kept asking us questions on the way. What were they doing? Why was there a chair on fire? They cut the cow's throat? How many were there? What did they look like? What were they driving? That last question stumped us. We hadn't seen any cars or trucks. The road was the only way in or out, and there was a creek that ran on the backside of the end of that particular road, so they couldn't have gone that direction. How had they gotten there with 2 recliners? When we got to that last stretch of road, the headlights found the spot where the recliner had been sitting. It was gone. We could all see where the road and surrounding grass was burned, but the recliner was not there. As we got closer, James noticed that the cow was gone too. I hate to admit, but I was getting scared all over again. I was afraid that his dad would tell us that it was our imagination and not believe us. When we got closer to the burnt spot in the road, Buster, James' dad, noticed the chair off in the ditch on the left side of the road. Then I noticed the cow on the other side. It was also in the ditch. The paper plates were all gone. Buster got out to look at the cow with the other men. They stood there talking and shaking their heads for what seemed like 10 minutes before getting back into the trucks. We continued toward the hill. The ruts made by spinning motorcycle tires were easily seen, but there was no fire on the other side of the hill. We all went down to where the other recliner had been burning, but it and the camp table were gone. You could see where someone had walked around the charred area and covered it with dirt. After we left, James saw a paper plate about 50 feet on the other side of the fence. Buster called the county sheriff when we got home, and by that time it was daylight and we went out again with the sheriff and a deputy. When we got back to the road, the first recliner and the cow were gone, but you could still see where something had been on fire and there was still blood on the road and in the grass. James showed them the shoe prints we'd seen. At the bottom of the hill, you could still see the charred area where the second recliner had been burning, and the deputy found little scuff marks where the table had been sitting. At the end of the road, you could see where the top strand of the fence had been tugged down and wrapped around the lower strand so someone could crawl over it. You could also see where the grass and weeds had been trampled, providing a fairly easy trail to follow. We found a woman's tennis shoe on the other side of the creek. You could see where someone had climbed up the bank on the far side of the creek. We followed the trail all the way across the field up to the next dirt road. Again, the top wire was wrapped around the next lower wire and there was a piece of red bandana-looking material caught in it. There were marks on the road where 2 or 3 different cars had spun their tires when they left. Buster also found a large piece of glass that had blood on it. Buster filed a report for the missing cow. They'd found 4 more cows in the opposite direction from where me and James had gone. They never found the recliners or the missing cow. The sheriff called a few days later and told Buster that the blood on the glass was human and not bovine. It was his guess that the pitcher broke and someone cut their hand while carrying it back to their vehicles. 2 weeks after that, there was a huge scare in our community about some cult that had promised the area at large that they were going to sacrifice a blonde-haired virgin girl and boy. Buster always said that it was just someone running their mouth after hearing about our incident. It was all anyone talked about that summer. Buster also said that he sure likes to know what happened to that cow. Sorry it was so long. I got chill bumps while remembering all of this. This happened in 1988 to 89 and I still think about it. Tell me if you want to read some of the other creepers I have. Story 7. A bed for the night. When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories, but this was the one that stood out. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit family. He had to change trains at one point and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform and a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods, there was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter and getting colder and darker, and just about the time he started worrying about a place to stay and some food to eat, an old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such a train, and when he said he was, she said it wouldn't be long until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night, and offered him a meal and room at her house, which she said was about an hour's walk from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when traveling in this part of the USSR, and Great-Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he was glad to accept her offer. He took his suitcase and they set off together down the dark road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, more like 2, and by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story house, John was tired and hungry. They went inside and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed some borscht for them. It was the first time John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realize that the old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care, John finished his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing else. He thanked her, they said goodnight, and she closed the door. Then she locked it, leaving him in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called to her, but she didn't answer and he heard nothing else. Figuring he would deal with it in the morning, and that she had probably done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down and laid on the bed, deciding to make the best of it and get some sleep. Before he could fall asleep, though, he felt the urge to pee and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees and began to feel under the bed in the darkness, thinking that's where the pot would be if there was one. Instead, he found a body. "Nope," Great Uncle John said, and went right to the window to see if he could exit the room that way. It was nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in the room, he was probably a dead man. But if he broke the window and tried to get out that way, there was a good chance that the old woman, and who knows who else was there, would hear him and come into the room before he could get away. So he did the only thing he could do. He pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress and covered it with the blanket. Then he got under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs and then toward the room. The lock clicked, and the knob turned slowly. In the gloom, John saw someone move toward the bed. Then he heard several terrific and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the bed with a large crowbar, which they then dropped onto the floor right in front of John. There was silence, then the person went out of the room, and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs, and then there was silence again. John moved out from under the bed, took the crowbar and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw his suitcase out, then dove through himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. He landed without too much injury, and began to run into a field behind the house toward some lights in the far distance. It turned out to be a highway with some military and transport trucks on it, and John was able to get a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what had happened to the authorities, since at that time in the USSR, there was a distinct chance he would have been the one who got into trouble. He just thanked God he escaped and decided that the next time he traveled to visit relatives, he would take another way. Story 8. I grew up across the street from one of the most notorious mass school shooters. We moved to Connecticut the summer before I entered 6th grade, so 2001, into a beautiful new house in one of the most beautiful towns. A bit more rural than we were used to in New Jersey, but it was an adjustment. My sister is 2 years younger than me, so was going into 4th grade at the time. It's relevant. We came from a neighborhood where we were all super close and everyone knew one another, block parties every summer, kids running back and forth to one another's houses. We were sad to leave it. Within the first few weeks, we met some of our neighbors. Everyone was what we soon defined as very Connecticut. It was all a bit surface and nobody had that New Jersey warmth that we'd be used to. Judge and Jay all you want, people are friendly. In particular, our neighbors directly across the street seemed a bit odd. The mom would come over to vent to my mom about her sons and husband, or ex-husband. We couldn't really figure it out at the time, and my mom was a sweetheart and was welcoming and warm. The holidays came around and the neighbor boy across the street was in my sister's 4th grade class. My sister came back slightly alarmed with what had happened in class that day. The students were asked to make a Thanksgiving turkey out of a trace drawing of their hands. On each finger, they were to write things they were thankful for. The neighbor wrote things like, being a loser, hating myself, etc., very dark things for a 4th grader. Fast forward to Christmas, and my mom hears that they have nowhere to go for the holidays, so she politely invites the mother and 2 sons to our annual Christmas Eve party. The boys were so strange. They listened to Japanese techno with headphones on and spoke to nobody. They headed straight to our basement to play video games. It was weird. The younger one was always much stranger than the older one, and the neighbor mom would always open up to my mom and aunt, who works with special needs students, about how he would hurt himself, and how he needed to be put in special needs programs but that he could never quite be diagnosed. They thought he was on the spectrum at first, but that quickly proved to not be the case. We always assumed she'd been confiding in them because my aunt was experienced with special needs kids and that she was looking for advice. Christmas Eve stands out to me because they were at our home, in a very intimate setting, but we saw them on a daily basis. My sister and I would come home from school telling my mom about how weird the younger neighbor boy was, and that something was off. I will never forget her telling us, just be nice to him, you don't know what he is capable of. That struck me as so odd at the time, but we listened. I don't know if his mother told my mom something that scared her and made her say it, or she just had a gut instinct. Recently after that, and I can't quite remember if this was middle school or high school, I think I was in 9th grade and my sister and younger neighbor boy were in 7th, so we all rode the bus together. What my mom said stuck out in my mind, so today I decided to be friendlier than usual. There was snow on the ground and the younger neighbor boy was drawing something in it and muttering to himself, "Ku mi I luku," no idea how that should be spelled, but that's what he was saying on repeat and drawing in the snow. It stuck with me. I decided to greet him. "Hi Adam, good morning." No eye contact. "I'll bomb you," he said, making no eye contact. We let it slide. Came home and told my mom. She reiterated, "Just be nice. We don't know what he's capable of." Keep in mind we were kids. We didn't know what to take seriously and what not to. I wish we had done more. Keep in mind, he wasn't someone who was bullied or made fun of, he was always off, in the sense that he could not hold eye contact or a conversation, or even a hello. Kids didn't make fun of him, he was a loner, but it seemed to be by choice. I didn't know why we were cautious/afraid around him other than the fact that he showed zero warmth, zero humanity. We knew he had special needs, so we never really second-guessed anything and just tried to be as polite as possible. When the bus would drop us all off at our respective houses, he would run all the way up his driveway on the hill with his hands by his sides and then turn around and kind of make a hiss noise down at everyone making claws with his hands. It was always so odd, but again, we were kids, and there are always a couple of kids in school who are a little strange. We took it as just that. They were invited to several Christmas Eves, so my memories kind of blend here. One year, the neighbor mom started screaming at my innocent grandmother for being a Yankees fan. She was a Red Sox fan. It was beyond strange because my G-ma is the cutest little lady of all time and was in no way trying to argue over sports. It was as though the woman clearly had a weird switch go off. She was always nice to me, but I'll be honest, we rolled our eyes every time my mom invited them. It was always such forced conversations with her, and as a teenager, I wanted nothing to do with being cornered into another chat. I think she must have just been lonely. The following year, and the final year they were invited to Christmas Eve, was when she got into it with my mom about having guns in the house. The boys only attended the first couple of Christmas Eves, so it was just the mom this time around. The topic of guns came up. The neighbor mom started telling my mom about how she has guns in the house and how she takes her younger boy to the shooting range all of the time. My mom said that she didn't agree with having guns in the house, wasn't trying to argue, but the neighbor mom got out of hand about it. Very defensive and ultimately getting aggressive about how she grew up in New Hampshire and that's just the way of life there. The neighbor mom told us how brilliant the younger neighbor boy was, and that he had hacked into some of the government's highest levels of security and that the CIA showed up on his doorstep. We have absolutely no idea if this story is true or not, but this is what she told us, so it became our ongoing joke when anything strange happened at our house. There were a few odd things throughout the years. Our internet had clearly been messed with, lights would flicker in the house, and we would joke that it was a young neighbor boy each time. It wasn't until December 14, 2012 that we knew just what he was capable of. I was out of college, working outside of Philadelphia, my sister still a student in college, and my youngest brother a student at the high school. The worst day of all of our lives. My dad heard the gunshots in the morning that killed the neighbor mom, Nancy Lanza. He assumed it had been a hunter in the area, maybe a little closer than usual. Until the FBI showed up and he had to evacuate the house as snipers lined our driveway. My mom was at the mall and we were all frantically calling one another as the news broke slowly throughout the day. At first, they had his identity wrong and said it was his brother, but we knew it had to have been him. Thank God for my mom making sure we were as nice as possible. Although I don't know that it would have stopped him. I wish we had done more at the time. I wish we knew to do more at the time. We didn't. We didn't want to assume the worst out of someone. I wish we had. 20 students, 6 teachers, killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School that day. The worst act of evil I have ever experienced so directly in my life and I hope will never fucking experience again. I'm thankful that we survived growing up across the street from him, but gutted for those who did not get so lucky. Little kids. In a place that should be the safest haven for them in their youth. I hate it so much. I know I will never see him again, but regardless, Adam Lanza, let's not meet ever again. Story, mine. Old Man in the Woods. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek through woodland and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass, no GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. Anyway, I was out of shape at the time and so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight like what I would have to during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through woods and a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back to the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees either side. We were marching onward in silence at this point when all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked late 70s/early 80s, very pale, liver spots dotting his face and a gray/white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought of seeing a guy his age out there in those clothes in those weather conditions was, this guy has lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice though that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be frozen and shocked at seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking him if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After maybe a minute he disappeared ahead of us but we could hear him so continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down and the slope was probably at a 40-degree angle, spanned for perhaps 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold on to or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering, how the heck did he cross that so quickly and so cleanly? I mean, at that distance it is hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear he still did not appear to be wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step toward the edge and was going to try and make my way down when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath he said to me, "Something's wrong here." We took a few steps back from the edge at this point and the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us again to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help, his friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon, that they would have all the tools to help him, etc. The old man suddenly got furious, he began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now or there would be hell to pay. His voice had changed drastically, he was practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out of their sockets, his skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail we practically power marched the remaining quarter mile or so to the car, all the while my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get to our car and await the police so we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later we met 4 officers, 2 who had dogs with them and packs of supplies like first aid, emergency blankets, etc. We lead them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he lead us through the bushes. The search lasted all weekend but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. One of my weirdest experiences to date. Story 10. Roommate wanted, female only. This is a popular story with my family and most of my friends. Amanda is my brother's girlfriend. At the time of this story, she was looking for her first apartment and moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together since they had only dated for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled something like, "Roommate Wanted, Females Only." This sort of thing was common since the area she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap compared to most places listed. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that wasn't comfortable with living with any males. The other roommate would have their own room and attached bathroom. So far, Amanda was into this place. However, the listing only had a single photo from outside the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house. Within 30 minutes, she receives an email back with all the details and time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by at 8 p.m. When Amanda arrives, there is a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken, use back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice but slightly unkempt, tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. Still no alarms for Amanda though. When she knocks on the back door and an older man opens the door. At first Amanda thinks she has the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant, I forget the name, was out and he was the landlord. The occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms start going off but aren't at red alert yet. First, the guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. No furniture. Nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions but seemed irritable at keeping lights on for too long, rushing her around and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord wouldn't open, telling her that it was the occupant's room and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walk down the hallway into the living room, she notices the front door has a plank nailed across it. Broken for sure. Amanda's creepometer is starting to ding, so she decides to wrap up the walkthrough and leave, but trying to be polite. As she's giving the guy her "thanks for the showing" bit, he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement. It's recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and she should take a look down there. At the time, Amanda and the landlord are standing in the small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outward to create something of a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement is pitch black. He smiles, motions down the stairs, and says, "Ladies first." What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda gets a text just as some random person parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers her phone. "Hey. Yeah, are you here? I'll come out from around back and let you in. It's great, you have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out of the back door. She says the guy just looked at her like he was confused. Once outside, she sprinted to her car and sped like hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told her mother and my brother everything. Cops were called, they took her statement, and went to investigate. The Craigslist post had been removed. Epilogue. The house had been foreclosed over 6 months earlier and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found that the closed room the landlord didn't want her to look in was where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old dirty blankets, rotten food, and empty gallon jugs everywhere. More creepy was he had plastered ripped-up pages from porno mags on all the walls in the room. Where do they even find porno mags? The really scary part of this was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine at about shin level across the stairs about halfway down. The basement was empty except another pile of old blankets, a broom handle wrapped in leather belts, and a small box with a few rolls of assorted tape, duct, electric, etc. Amanda ended up not moving in. Story 11. Don't take the back roads. First, I'm sorry for the length. Writing this out was actually pretty therapeutic and I may have gotten ahead of myself a little. I've lived most of my life out in the valley countryside of Ontario. Given that's not a whole lot for an 18-year-old, but for me it's the only place I can call home, and I like to think that I know the entire area, as far and sprawling as it is, like the back of my hand. Adventures across the long, cross-crossing roads, pastures and woods that made up the skeleton of my village were a common venture in my childhood. As a young kid, I had a habit of biking extremely far out in hopes of finding new places, and sometimes my dad or one of my friends' parents would toss out bikes in their pickup and take us way out onto a back road and let us explore for a few hours. This was how a lot of us first found that on one of these crappy gravel roads surrounded by thin woods was a worn-down old shack sitting just about 20 meters off of the path. Honestly, I never thought anything of it, except for the fact that it was creepy. It had no windows to see inside, and I never went anywhere near it, but one of my friends at the time said that her older sister had tried to go in it and that the door was always locked. We all had better things to be curious about at the time than that anyway, so I quickly moved on and it became nothing more than a mundane landmark of that area. Honestly, I had completely forgotten about it for a few years now. Except last Tuesday, I was coming home from one of my very late classes at my university, and I usually take the back roads I perused many years ago, as they're more straightforward and scarcely ever have any sort of traffic. As I drove down the gravel path that would wind along the side of the country and eventually take me to the next street I needed to turn onto, I noticed a faint glinting coming from within the trees up ahead, maybe about 100 meters from my car. A flashlight? I thought, but as my car came closer, I realized what I was really seeing. The light inside of the shack was on. I should mention now that in all of the nearly 13 years I've spent living in my area, I have never seen the door open, and I've never seen a light on inside of that shack, ever. Not even once. I must have driven past that shack probably almost 100 times in my life, but this was the first time I'd ever seen any sign of a person's presence having been anywhere near that thing. That, coupled with the fact that it was 10 o'clock at night and pitch black outside aside from my own headlights, and the faint, incandescent glow lighting up the doorframe up ahead, immediately filled me with what I can only describe as a weird sense of dread. It would be hard for most people not to be immediately unsettled by something like that, and I am someone who's easily spooked. Fortunately, while my car approached the light, I was curious enough that despite the feeling in my stomach I slowed down as I was about to pass, hoping that I could see what was going on inside, and this is probably the only reason I managed to spot the dark shape that burst out of the foliage on the side of the road, directly into my path. I wasn't going very fast at that point, but I still pounded the brakes rather hard in alarm, so my car came to a crunching stop on the gravel. For a moment, I was just really confused and freaked out. What was that? Had I almost hit a deer or something? This far out in the country, a deer would have been the most likely and most reasonable assumption. But in the beams of my car I could see what had stopped me, a very tall, very lanky old man, with scraggly and balding gray hair. Right away I got the impression that this man was very poor. He looked dirty and unkempt, and his clothes hung off of him. However, I'm generally used to seeing people who aren't that well off in my town, and I don't like to judge people right away based off of that sort of thing, so I was mostly just extremely unsettled over what the hell this guy was doing way out here, and why he had walked out in front of my car. As I sat there confused, the old man came around to my window and knocked on the glass. Feeling my memories of stranger danger conversations with my parents kicking in, as old as those conversations were, I rolled down the window just a crack, only enough for someone to be able to hear me and for me to hear them. I was already creeped out enough as it was. Immediately, I had to say what I was thinking. What are you doing out here?" I asked. In my peripheral vision I could still see the light from the shack, but in my mind's eye I wasn't really registering it anymore. Stupid, I know. I should have made the connection immediately, but I was still kind of shaken by the fact that I could have run this guy over if I hadn't been able to stop in time, and being a new driver and all the thought of that was terrifying. After a small pause, the man started talking to me. He had a thick, croaky sort of voice, and he spoke very slowly. "My truck, it's broken," he explained. But I was also getting the feeling that he wasn't really all there, mentally. I didn't have to look around to notice there wasn't any truck on the side of the road, but I did anyway, turning my head around to confirm what I already knew. There was definitely no truck. Had he somehow driven it into the trees or something? As far as I could remember and see, there wasn't enough space anywhere in them for a truck to fit through. What was the man talking about? While I was looking, it was honestly as though I could feel that he was watching me, and when I turned back he was still leaning down to peer inside of my window at me. Where? I don't see it. I blurted. I was definitely distrustful of this guy already. At first he didn't respond, and my nerves were only getting worse the longer we were alone out here. Then he replied. "It's just up the road," he said, turning just to point with his finger in that general direction. The lights on my car aren't exactly the greatest, but I could still see far enough that I really couldn't imagine where on earth this truck was supposed to be. I couldn't spot the faintest sight of it. While I squinted up ahead, he continued, "I'll show you where, if you come." At this point, I really had no idea what this old man was thinking I could do to help. I'm 18 years old, female, and very petite. I don't exactly look like the type of person who knows a lot about cars or how to fix them, and for the record, I'm really not. But I was tired from a long day at school, so I absolutely was not at my brightest, and for some reason, a part of me felt guilty about leaving him out here alone if his truck really was broken. "Okay," I said, and I reached for my gear shift to start driving slowly up the road, but as soon as he saw my hand he shook his head. "Just walk, it's not too far." "Well, excuse me, but no thanks. How the hell was I going to see anything in the dark if I got out of my car and followed him, anyway? There was no harm in driving wherever he was trying to lead me. The more I talked to the guy, the more unnerved I was getting, and the more red flags were starting to pop up in my mind. I couldn't see a car anywhere, and this total stranger wanted me to get out of mine and follow him into the dark on this creepy road in the middle of nowhere. I will admit I am a bit of a naive person, but I'm definitely not that stupidly so. "No, I'd rather drive to it," I responded. This situation really wasn't making any sense to me. I could see his brow furrow, and he looked kind of agitated. He insisted, "Your car won't fit in the trees, anyway." So, did his truck crash then? Why the trees, if we were going up the road? I remembered what I'd just been thinking a minute earlier about there not being enough space, and I asked him, "Then how did yours get in the trees?" The only logical explanation would have been that his truck had swerved off the road. But even if that were the case, there was seriously nothing at all that I could have done to help him fix his car or get it back out again. It genuinely made no sense at all to be asking me to come with him and help, and the entire situation was beginning to make me very scared. There was a lengthy enough pause between my question and him speaking up that I was beginning to think he didn't hear me or something, so I asked again. Still no immediate answer. When he finally did reply, he was staring at me directly in the eyes. I think I'm going to have nightmares about it for a long time. It was so sudden, and the way he said it was just so unbelievable. "You don't look old enough to drive." I hear comments like this a lot, since I do look very young because of my size. Normally somebody would say this with a smile or something to signify that this is, in fact, meant to be taken as a joke, but the guy's face didn't change even slightly. He just kept staring at me with a completely cold expression. The sheer inappropriateness of such a remark in that kind of situation immediately had my heart racing, and all I could think was, holy fucking shit. What did this guy want with me? What I wanted to say next was, "Who the fuck are you?" But instead I anxiously fumbled for my phone in my pocket, babbling in a way that probably made it really obvious I was completely freaked out of my mind. Okay, I can just call someone to come help you out, there's not really anything I can do." As I said that, it occurred to me to wonder, did this old guy not have a cell phone of his own? I know not every older person has one even if they're becoming much more common, but seriously, and then I also remembered, with a sudden streak of massive fear, the shack with the light on. I could still see the light coming from it just up ahead in the trees, and my dumb brain finally put two and two together. The old man hadn't even mentioned it at all. It was like it wasn't even there to him, and there was definitely no one out there that could have turned the light on but the guy who was standing outside my car right now. What was he doing out here in that shack, then, which had been locked for all these years by someone I never knew? There was definitely no truck around here. He wanted me out of my car for another reason. I think maybe the old man must have seen on my face that I was scared out of my wits and about to book it out of there. Instead of any words, without warning, his face contorted with rage, and he swung his fist, pounding it against my window with enough strength to make it shudder. His eyes were wide and he looked furious and completely fucking insane. Even though I was panicking more than I ever had in my life and I was sure he was about to smash the window and if he tried again, I screamed, threw my phone onto the floor, switched gears and slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. I hurtled down the road, and when I glanced into my rearview mirror I saw his dark shape turn from standing in the road, and I watched as he turned, and he walked off the road, directly back towards the light of the shack. I didn't slow down at all until I was nearly home, and absolutely sure that there was no way that he could have followed me. When I got home that night I spent a long time crying about what had happened with my mom, and though I don't think she believed all of what I told her, we don't have the greatest relationship, she called up everyone she knew to ask if anyone knew the old man, or if they knew who owned that shack. In a town like ours, just about everyone knows each other, but no one had any clue who he was. One of our family friends even swore that he was sure it's been abandoned for at least 4 years now, and since most people don't usually take that road, no one said that they've ever seen a light on or the door open but me. I've been taking a different route home from school since, and I really don't think I ever want to head back down that road. Creepy guy in the shack, please, let's not meet again. Judy went down the back road at night, found a creepy old guy in a shack trying to convince me to get out of my car. Said no and he tried to attack me. Never seen another soul around that shack before, and I'm not sure what to make of it. Story 12. Prettier. When I was in 3rd grade, I made a friend named Nicholas. Nicky for short. We were both on the quieter side compared to our classmates, and we both shared a love for pudding cups. One day at school, Nicky forgot his lunch at home, so I told him he could have my pudding cup. That's how we became friends. From that moment on, we shared my pudding cups every day. The other kids in our class used to tease us, accusing us of having crushes on each other and chanting that horrible to an 8-year-old at least, kissing song all the time. It had become customary for Nicky and I to separate ourselves from the other kids at recess and at lunch. We had a big tree we would always meet under, in the morning, at recess and for a few minutes after school before our parents came to pick us up. Nicky himself lived with his older sister and single mother. He tried explaining the concept of divorce to me once, but in my 8-year-old mind it didn't make sense that his parents weren't together, happily married. As you can imagine, my parents were married, and my home life was the epitome of an adoring, nuclear family. Imagine Full House, except with a mother who hadn't passed away, and a couple of cousins instead of uncles. I can't recall a single moment in my childhood where I was left unloved or uncared for in any way. I soon realized that was a rarity. During one of mine and Nicky's morning visits to the tree, as we had cleverly nicknamed it, he invited me to his birthday party. He excitedly unzipped his backpack and withdrew an invitation card made of blue construction paper. There was a hand-drawn tree on the front, 2 little kids of approximately mine and Nicky's size and coloring, and a home address scribbled inside. To this day I still have it. When the bell rang, he and I ran inside with the rest of the kids and I waited all day for him to give out the rest of his birthday invitations, but he never did. I was the only one he had invited. Because the other kids teased us so much, my 8-year-old mind had chalked it up to the conclusion that he didn't want any bullies there and had therefore invited his only friend. Suffice to say I was flattered and happy. I gave the card to my mother later on in the evening. She smiled and said, "How cute," and very quickly gave me permission to go. It was my first non-family birthday party. The next day I went to the store with my mother and older brother and we picked out a birthday present for Nicky. He and I were heavily into Transformers, so we got him a tiny Transformer after getting permission from his mother, and I wrapped it up in blue wrapping paper all by myself. His birthday was on the following Saturday. My mother dropped me off at Nicky's house, briefly speaking with his mother in the kitchen, discussing pickup times and how fast they're growing, before kissing me on the forehead goodbye. Because Nicky, his sister, and I were the only ones there, we decided to play a couple of board games and then tag when it wasn't raining anymore. We were in the backyard. It got to be a little sunny after, and Nicky and I fell deep into our dramatic reenactment of the latest and most exciting Power Rangers episode to date. That we had seen at least. His sister, a preteen at the time, went inside for a minute to check something, which Nicky later revealed to me was a code phrase she used when she wanted to talk to the cute neighbor boy on the phone. Inside the kitchen, his mother was cooking and keeping an eye on us through the window. It was only as we went inside to eat that I realized there were no decorations. In fact, there wasn't anything to signify that it was Nikki's birthday at all, except for the homemade chocolate cake. I had loosely gathered that Nikki's family didn't have a lot of money, and that maybe that was the reason he went to school without lunch so often, but I never really asked and Nikki never really said anything. Not that an 8-year-old would do either of those things. We went down to the basement after we cut the cake and took a couple photos, where there was a tiny TV and an SNES. We played video games for roughly 10 minutes before there was a loud knock on the door. Nikki stopped the game, Yoshi's Island, and jogged up the basement stairs to answer the door, eventually screaming, "Dad. I thought you said you couldn't come." He was very excited. Understandably so, considering how rarely he saw his father and what a big occasion it was in his life when he did. He would always tell me about it at school. That his cool, fun dad came to visit and took him for a ride around the block on his motorcycle. For a while, I'll admit I wasn't sure if I believed his dad actually owned a motorcycle, but when Nikki came down to introduce me to his dad, I followed them outside into the front yard and saw a big, black Harley parked in the driveway. There were 2 helmets. One for his dad and one for him. I was instantly jealous. My own father drove a minivan and wore polo shirts and cargo pants almost religiously. Nikki's dad, however, was the complete and total opposite of mine. He wasn't suburban at all. In fact, he looked like a character out of The Outsiders. Right away, I thought he was cool, and right away, I wanted to fit in with them. I should note that Nikki and I came from different ethnic backgrounds. He was white, I was not. Because I went to school with majority white kids and lived in a town with a majority white population, I found it very difficult to fit in sometimes. That was part of the reason I had grown too close to Nikki so quickly. He was pretty much the only kid in school who gave me the time of day and him. The other kids didn't like me because I looked different and they didn't like Nikki because he wore old, faded clothes. He was raised on a modest salary. His mother had a few jobs if I remember correctly. She was a waitress, a grocery store clerk, and a part-time janitor. For a single mother with 2 growing kids, a house, and a car that was always breaking down, she was really quite optimistic. I liked her a lot. She was always nice. Even when she caught one of the bullies in school shoving Nikki to the ground once, she was nice. So when she wasn't nice to Nikki's father, and when she pulled him aside to ask him to leave the party, I couldn't help but wonder why. My mother picked me up soon after, and I made a pact with Nikki that I would come over again very soon. Because my mother had finally met him in person and spoke with her, I was allowed to come over and play now. Before that, she would always tell me, "Not until I meet his mother." From that point on, I went over to Nikki's house 2 or 3 times every week. Sometimes his mother would be there, sometimes his older sister would be there. One of them was always there to look after us and make sure we didn't get up to any trouble. We would usually just go down to his basement and play video games, or, when the weather would allow it, we would ride bikes in the cul-de-sac and jump on his tiny trampoline. He was always better at flips than me, and I kind of resented him for it. One time he tried to teach me how to front flip and I nearly landed on my head. The second I got to my feet, I ran away and started crying, mostly due to embarrassment. I wanted Nikki to think I could hang, but I couldn't really do any of the cool things he could. My own parents thought trampolines were too dangerous and forbade me from jumping on Nikki's. I used to do it anyway. Kids will be kids. Nikki thought I was cool, though, and to get my crybaby ass to feel better, he admitted he was a little jealous of me. He said he was jealous of my new clothes, my new bike, and just everything new that I had. That was the first time he opened up to me about being less privileged. The SNES in his basement was an old gift from a cousin of his who lived in the next town over, but it barely worked half the time. That was probably why his cousin gave it away. We sat in his basement for a few minutes talking about all the little reasons we were jealous of each other, and then his sister came down to say she was going to the mall with her friends, but that their dad was coming over to look after us. Their mother was at work that afternoon. For whatever reason, Nikki was shocked to hear his dad was coming over. I took it as a surprise visit and ran outside with Nikki when we heard the motorcycle. Indeed, his dad was there, and he also had a late birthday present for Nikki in his hands. It was a box, roughly the size of his head, and it was wrapped in newspaper. When we went inside to open it, he made Nicky promise not to tell his mother what he got him. Apparently his mother didn't want Nicky to get a present from his dad, but his dad bought him a present anyway. Nicky readily nodded, so I followed his lead. I watched Nicky tear the newspaper to shreds, revealing a brand new Polaroid camera. Nicky had no idea what it was at first, looking to his dad for answers before I excitedly said, "A camera! You got a camera!" I could tell Nicky felt embarrassed that he didn't know right away, but he was also just so happy that he got something. He brushed the embarrassment aside and we opened the box to play with it. His dad taught us how to use it and explained how it worked to us. He pointed it at Nicky and snapped the first photo, flapping it in the air after, and then showing us the final product. It was very cool to me that the photos came out right away. My family had a camera too, but we had to wait for the photos to get developed at a store. By that time I'd always forget and lose interest. But Nicky's new Polaroid camera printed out photos right away. Nicky loved it and I loved it, and his dad really seemed to love it too. When his dad pointed the camera at me next, I smiled like a dork and we all laughed at the photo after. My front teeth were missing and I looked like I was pretty high. Nicky and I traded our photos after. He kept a photo of me and I kept a photo of him. We said we'd be friends for as long as we kept the photos of each other intact, so I took extra good care of mine. Now that we had a new toy to play with, I was always asking to go over to Nicky's. Because I lived in a house with so many other family members and relatives, I felt lost there sometimes. When I went to Nicky's, I felt more like I belonged and it was always quieter there too. It was the mid-90s at this time, so parents were less strict with their young children, and mine allowed me to spend hours at Nicky's as long as his mother was okay with it. She always was. She loved having me around because she knew how happy it made Nicky to have a friend to hang out with. My mother would frequently send me to Nicky's house with some sort of dish or snack, and she even invited Nicky's family to my house for dinner once. My family really liked his family, and I think my older brother had a tiny crush on his older sister, but she was all about the neighbor boy, so tough luck, bro. For this reason, I was allowed to go to Nicky's house almost every day now. He didn't live too far from my house either. We were within walking distance of each other, maybe 5 blocks away. His house was one of the few places I knew how to get to, apart from my own. There were times when I would go straight to his house with him from school, and times when he would come over to play with me at mine. The latter happened rarely as we both preferred his house. Mine was just way too crowded. One day at school, Nicky told me his dad had come over the other night and got mad at him for not taking any new photos with the Polaroid he got for his birthday. Both Nicky and I loved the Polaroid and we thought it was very cool the first few times we played around with it, but, as most kids do, we eventually lost interest in it, and Nicky sort of just tucked it under a blanket in the basement and forgot about it. I guess his dad didn't like that very much, so Nicky asked me if I'd help him take photos for the next time his dad comes to visit. In fact, his dad specifically requested that I be in the photos. I found this perfectly normal as an 8-year-old. I figured Nicky's dad wanted us to have fun with the camera and immortalize our friendship, make a scrapbook or something. Up until this point, Nicky's mother and sister still had no idea he even had a camera. I agreed I would come over soon and we would take a bunch of silly photos. But Nicky forgot to mention one thing to me. He forgot to mention that his dad would be there. It was the same story as last time. His mother was working, his sister was at the mall with friends, presumably with money their dad gave her, and their mother had no idea any of this was going on. I went over there after school, and I noticed the motorcycle parked out front. Nicky didn't seem surprised to see it, but something about his mood was off that day. I figured it was because he got in trouble the last time he saw his dad. Because it was raining a little, we went inside to hang out in the basement, where I thought we would play on the SNES for a bit, but that wasn't the plan at all. Nicky's dad was in the basement. He greeted me with a big smile and asked us how school was, if we did anything fun at recess, what kind of things we learned in class, the usual. I thought nothing of it as my parents would always ask me similar questions. Eventually Nicky's dad said we should start taking photos, so I obliged. I smiled widely for the camera, but instead of pressing the button and laughing at the photo like we had done the other day, Nicky's dad tooted at me and said I should try to look prettier. I had no idea what he meant by prettier, so I just smiled a little smaller and held it for a second before he corrected me again. As you can imagine, he kept at it, nitpicking at me until I let my hair down, telling me to pinch my cheeks before every photo to make sure they were flushed, rosy, and pretty. This whole time he hadn't taken a single photo of Nikki. Because it's been decades, and because I've somehow managed to block most of this out, I'm not entirely sure what led up to it, but Nikki's dad eventually convinced me to start taking articles of clothing off. First my jacket, then my socks, and then my cardigan, and then he asked Nikki to get in the frame. This whole time Nikki had been standing off to the side, not saying a word, and not looking at me either. It was like he felt something was wrong, but he was too afraid to say it. What ended up happening is exactly what you think. First, Nikki was told to hold my hands, then he hugged me, then put his face really close to mine, and then he was told to kiss me on the mouth. His dad snapped photos of it every step of the way, asking Nikki questions like, "Isn't she pretty? Don't you think she's pretty, Nick? Do you want to take her on dates?" It was a whole lot of that and a whole lot of touching. The whole time I stood completely still, not really sure of what was going on. Had any other boy been there with me, I'm not sure I would have remained so calm. Because it was Nikki, I felt somewhat safe. I didn't feel like we were doing anything wrong. The kiss was gross to me, but everything else I was mostly okay with. We stopped pretty quickly after that kiss, not because his dad wanted to, but because I had to go home. My mother came to pick me up. Usually my brother would, so he could talk to Nikki's sister a little bit, but he had basketball practice that day, so my mother came instead. For some reason Nikki's dad didn't go up to answer the door. He asked Nikki to do it, and I took a second to grab my jacket and sweater and put them on. During this time, while Nikki's dad and I were alone in the basement, he said he would come back to take more photos one day, and that I should wear makeup next time. I didn't have any at 8 years old, but I didn't have him like that. I just collected my things and got out of there to go home. I saw my mother at the door and she hugged me, asking how my day was, and suddenly, everything was normal again. For me anyway. I glanced back to wave bye to Nikki, but he had already closed the door. The next day at school, he completely ignored me. I went to the tree and waited there all morning and all recess, and for an extra 15 minutes after school, but he wasn't there. I saw him in class, so I knew he was at school. He just didn't want to hang out with me for some reason. This carried on for the rest of the week, until one day, my mother got a phone call from Nikki's mother. I was in the living room watching wrestling with my brother, and I vividly remember my mother's smile vanishing as she listened on the phone to whatever Nikki's mother was saying. I remember asking what was wrong, if Nikki was sick, but my mother didn't say anything to me. She just nodded and listened, face draining of color as though she had seen a ghost. Later, she asked to speak with me in my bedroom, and asked me very clearly, "Sweetie, who was there at Nikki's house the other day? Was it his sister Angela or someone else?" As soon as I said, "someone else," her eyes became watery and she asked what happened. I was vague on details because I wasn't really sure what had happened myself. It was such a blur to me at the time. The only thing I was worried about was Nikki, and why he had been ignoring me. Because I didn't want him to be more mad at me and ignore me for longer, I kept quiet about the camera, just saying that Nikki's dad watched us play and told me I was pretty. The last part was apparently enough to set off a huge red flag in my mother's mind. She gave me another hug, told me she wasn't mad at me and that everything would be okay really soon. So this is what happened. Apparently Nikki's mother had found the camera, asked Angela about it, and then Nikki quickly learned that their dad had been coming over without her knowledge. The rule was he could only visit when she was home, but the past few times she wasn't. The next day, I found Nikki under the tree at school, and he very seriously told me we couldn't be friends anymore. I asked why, and he said just because. He went so far as to give me back the Polaroid of me smiling like a dork, the one I had exchanged for the Polaroid of him, both of them signifying our friendship. Because nothing had really happened, because the world was a different place 20 years ago, and because the photos weren't explicit in nature. Nothing happened to Nikki's dad. But that's not for lack of trying on our mother's parts. I remember going to the police station, telling them everything with my mother there beside me, and repeating the story again to various lawyers, but the most we were able to accomplish was preventing Nikki's dad from seeing Nikki and Angela. Apparently, by coming to the house when Nikki's mother wasn't there, he had violated the terms of their custody agreement. When it was all over, the meetings and everything else, Nikki and his family ended up moving. Apparently Nikki knew this was going to happen, and that's why he told me we couldn't be friends anymore. I want to say I managed to give him the photo back before he left and that we shared a pudding cup one last time, but I can't, because those things never happened. He moved and I stayed, and for a really, really long time I sat alone at the tree during recess. Eventually I made new friends, eventually I stopped waiting for him to move back, and eventually I was a happy kid again, but I have never, not once in my life, forgotten about Nicky or what happened in his basement that day. The way everything about him changed so drastically. If it weren't for his dad, I'd like to think we would have remained friends, at least through childhood. The silver lining is social media exists, and when I was 17, I found a friend request from a boy named Nicky in my notifications. Nicky's dad, let's not meet. Ever again. Story 13. No good deed goes unpunished. This happened in the fall of 1993, when I was 20 years old. In the interest of context, this was before I started college, and I was working in the material prep department of a plastics factory on the night shift. I was the only woman in the department, and my male coworkers were initially skeptical that I could handle the job, but I proved myself and earned their respect. It was hard work, but on the plus side, it also put me in the best shape of my life. It was also about this same time that I dumped my abusive boyfriend. He was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive, as well as an alcoholic. This fact, more than anything, is probably why I got myself into this situation in the first place. I had just gotten off work, and it was about 1:30 a.m. My car was running on fumes, so I stopped at a local gas station to fill up. While I was pumping gas, a woman about my age approached me looking nervous and scared. She said that she had been at her boyfriend's house, and they'd had a fight. She'd walked to the gas station to use the payphone and called a friend to pick her up. On her way to the station, a car pulled up as she was walking and the guys inside started catcalling and harassing her. With a slight movement of her head, she indicated a car that was parked off to the side by the gas station dumpsters. I saw a large light green car, like a Caddy or a Lincoln, with at least 2 or 3 shadowy figures inside. She said they threatened her, and she was too scared to call her friend and wait. The woman was neat, well-dressed, and didn't seem high or drunk or anything like that. She just seemed really nervous and freaked out, so I didn't even hesitate. I finished pumping my gas and told her to hop in the car, that I'd take her home. At that time on a weeknight, there was little traffic, so I booked it right out of the gas station and asked her where she lived. She kept twisting around in the seat to see if the car was behind us, and when I asked her to put her seatbelt on, she ignored me and kept looking for the car. I assumed she was just scared. A few blocks down the road, however, I noticed she was looking around the car, and she started asking me about money. Where's your purse? Where's your bag? I need money. You need to give me some money. My stomach sank. I have this woman in my car, and now she's gonna rob me. But when I thought about it, robbery just didn't make much sense. I was driving a 1985 Chevette, affectionately nicknamed Shitbox, and was wearing my work clothes, a ratty t-shirt and jeans with combat boots. I did not look like a person with a lot of cash primarily because I wasn't a person with a lot of cash. She twisted around in the seat again and started yelling, "There they are! There they are!" She didn't sound scared anymore. I checked the rear view, and sure enough, the light green car is right behind me. She started cackling and bouncing up and down in the seat. "My boys are gonna frick you up, bitch. They're gonna frick you up." She's laughing like crazy, opening the glove box, looking in the back for a bag or purse, telling me all the messed up shit these guys are planning to do to me. Now, if I had been smart, I would have just driven to the police station. Actually, if I had been very smart, I would have called the cops from the gas station and waited with her until they arrived. That would have been the intelligent thing to do. Unfortunately, none of this crossed my mind until later. In the moment, I just got really, really freaking angry. I realized 3 key things all at once. There was an intersection up ahead, with cars on either side waiting to cross, and the light had just turned yellow. I had a spare box cutter that I kept for work in the driver's side door compartment. The crazy bitch still hadn't put on her seatbelt. I didn't think so. I floored it and passed under the yellow light just as it turned red. I glanced back to see if the green car was still behind me, but the cross traffic at the intersection had started to move, and they hadn't caught up. The bitch started yelling. I slammed on the brakes and she hit the dash and windshield with a solid and viciously satisfying crack. When she rebounded to the passenger seat, I had the box cutter in her face and was screaming some serious batshit crazy. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was along the lines of, "Get the frick out. Get the frick out of my car before I cut off your face and make you eat it, bitch." The crazy screaming and box cutter combo worked. She grabbed blindly at the handle and popped the door open, and I started shoving and punching her until the bitch tumbled out the door to the curb. I stomped on the gas, got to the next turn and squealed around it with the passenger door still open. I made a few more turns because I was afraid that the green car might catch up to me. After a little while I stopped to close the passenger door, and then I cut across town and got onto the highway to go home. I was on the highway for about 5 minutes before the shake started. I pulled off to the shoulder to calm down and get my shit together, and then I drove home. I told my older sister, I was living with her temporarily after the breakup with my ex, everything that happened. She wrapped me in a tight bear hug while simultaneously yelling about how stupid I was for not going to the police. I've never been so glad to be yelled at in my life. Story 14. I was the railroad killer, one who got away. I was 19, staying late at the college darkroom to develop some film for my photography class. The photography building, once a tobacco warehouse, was a dark, rickety hulk near some lonely railroad tracks in a little traveled part of campus. I finished developing my film close to midnight and headed out, nervous as always to be alone at night in this deserted part of town. It was dark, several of the streetlights around the parking lot were out, and the few that remained were phoning it in, putting out a weak flickery light that did nothing to reassure me as I headed toward my car. I heard him before I saw him, a scrape of feet on asphalt. He said, "Hey, can you do me a favor?" I startled and dropped my keys, and he mumbled an apology for scaring me. I noticed he was wearing a jogging suit and limping. "What do you need?" I said. He hobbled a step or two toward me. "I think I sprained my ankle. Could you take me to the ER?" The university hospital was a short distance down the road. I hesitated. The guy looked perfectly pleasant, and he did seem to be in pain. But I'd recently finished a book about serial killer Ted Bundy, who lured some of his victims by pretending to have a broken arm and asking for their help carrying books to his car. When they leaned over to put his stuff in the passenger seat of his VW Bug, he knocked them unconscious with a crowbar and stuffed them inside. This scene played across my mind as I looked at the guy. It also occurred to me to wonder why the hell anyone would want to jog in this creepy part of town. "I'm sorry, I can't do that. But I could call somebody for you. There's a phone in the photography building there." "There's nobody to call. I just moved here, I don't really know anybody. Can't you just drive me? It's right down Limestone Avenue." He leaned against a car and winced as he reached down to rub at his ankle. "I'll call you an ambulance," I offered. "No. I can't afford that, I don't have health insurance. Can you just drive me? I'll pay you $20. There was something in the way he said this last bit, something wrong. Like that exercise in my acting class, where we had to recite, "Mary had a little lamb," as though we were delivering a tragic monologue or a furious rant. There was a tone rising up that didn't quite match the words he was saying, a raw urgency that reached down inside me and hit the panic button hard. There was a moment of silence between us. "I can't help you," I said. "I'm leaving." I gripped my keys, slipping them between my fingers the way my mom had taught me, so I could use them as a weapon if he came at me. I kept my eyes on him as I speed-walked the last few feet to my car. He watched me drive away, still leaning against that car, a flat expression on his face. Away from the dark parking lot, driving through campus with my music turned up, the fear faded. I started to feel a little guilty for leaving the guy there, although I knew I'd done what my mom and dad would have wanted me to do. I was about to turn into my dorm parking lot when I realized I needed to pick up some stuff for breakfast the next morning, so I turned around and headed back in the direction I'd come. About a minute down the road, my stomach clenched. There was the guy in the jogging suit, running along the sidewalk. His ankle was perfectly fine. Later that summer, 2 students at my college were attacked by those same railroad tracks. The girl survived, but her boyfriend died. The man who attacked them was a serial killer dubbed the Railroad Killer by police. He murdered dozens of people across several states, most of them near railroad tracks. I didn't see his mugshot on TV until years later, but the picture broke me out in the same icy sweat I felt when I saw that guy running down the street. I can't be 100% positive, but my gut tells me I escaped a serial killer that night. Edited, to correct a factual error about the Railroad Killer murders. Edited again. Wow, guys, thanks for all the upvotes. This was my first post on Reddit, and it's great to get such a warm welcome. Much appreciated. Story 15. Violin Hill. So I'm new to Reddit and just discovered this sub, which is great because it means I can finally share this story. I know it's probably said a lot, and as always there's really no way to verify it, but what I'm about to tell you is 100% true. I'm not talented enough to make this up. Around 2 years ago, I finally moved into a brand new house in a brand new building estate in Australia. I was one of the first to have a finished build in the area and was elated to finally gain independence. The first few weeks went by as normal, and during that time, I'd often take walks alone with the dog in the afternoons and roam the surrounding estate area. All the roads around us had been partially completed and all the other properties were marked out, but no other houses were built excluding one that was directly opposite mine. The house looked finished, but there was no driveway laid yet, and from what I could gather, no one lived there. To the left of my house, roughly a few hundred meters away, was a field with a huge hill in it. I later found out that the whole area was council property. Not only was no one allowed to build up there, but the whole hill was basically a no-go zone. For whatever reason, the council just didn't want people on it, so the whole area was surrounded by a huge chain-link fence. The only other noticeable feature in the area was a small abandoned farmhouse with a shed a few kilometers down the road. I knew nothing about it and often went walking there with the dog, as it gave me something mild to explore amongst the vast nothingness I was living around. The entire place was dilapidated and completely inhabitable, but it was still interesting nonetheless. About a month or two after moving in, I awoke one morning to the sound of a violin. It sounded extremely distant and quiet, haunting. I actually enjoyed it and assumed that the neighbors opposite me has finally moved in. Excited that I finally had some people to talk to, I peeked out the curtain and saw the house opposite mine was still as vacant as it ever was. I got dressed, but by the time I managed to look outside, the violin has stopped. This happened roughly every second day for the next week. The violin would wake me up and then just disappear after about 45 seconds. I'd ignored it to the point where my curiosity simply got the better of me, and the next morning when I heard the violin playing again, I immediately jumped out of bed, threw on my dressing gown and shot out the front door. I scoured the early morning surrounding, and there, up on the hill, was a figure playing a violin. It was barely light, but the person looked very tall from the distance I was at, and as they were playing, was doing what could only be described as a waltz-type walk, spinning slowly around in a circle as they played. I took my eyes off the person and walked over to pick up the morning paper, and in the 10 seconds that took me, I heard the violin stop. When I looked up, I noticed the figure was no longer playing or dancing, but was now standing still and most likely looking in my direction. It was so dark I couldn't make out any more, and we both just stood there for half a minute not moving before the creeps got the better of me and I went back inside. After that morning, things started happening. On my walks I began to notice footprints on the surrounding properties that weren't made by me and that I'd never seen before, which I just assumed were from people walking up from the other housing areas down the road. I never awoke to the violin, but I swore I could hear someone walking on the street next to my bedroom window in the early mornings. However, I never saw anything. Other really general things as well, like random tools such as spades and rakes laying around the area, which I guessed were left there by construction crews, none of which I ever saw. I'd started getting calls at work that would immediately hang up on me, and I also stopped walking up to the abandoned farmhouse, as the experience with the violin player had me a little shaken. One night as I was heading to bed, I turned off the television in the living room and again could hear the faint sound of a violin playing. However, it sounded more muffled and rehearsed. I froze and a cold chill flowed through me instantaneously. Considering that it was about midnight and not the usual time I'd hear it playing, I went to the front window and peeked out to see that there was a light in the house opposite mine. It was clearly a candle as I could see the dim light flicker in the empty window and the music sounded like it was coming from an old record player, but in the 10 minutes I watched, I never saw any movement inside the house. I moved away from the window sufficiently freaked out and after another 5 minutes, I heard the music abruptly stop. I peeked out again to notice the light was now out. I never saw anyone. I began to become unsettled in the house and would often invite friends over to hang out until late, but of course nothing would ever happen when someone else was with me. I never bothered to tell any of my friends as without evidence, I figured they'd just give me shit about it and I'd just become more agitated. But nothing compared to what happened next. In my living area, the desk sits right next to a small window which looks out to the fence surrounding my property. The steel fence is literally an arm's length from the house and about 6 feet tall, so I always figured that, unlike most of the other windows, I'd never need to cover this one with a sheet or blanket because noone could ever see in. I usually had headphones on when I played and I always had the lights off, for no other reason than I preferred to play games in the dark. One night when I was gaming, I got up and walked into the dark kitchen and got a beer out of the fridge. It was dead silent excluding the faint sound coming out of my headphones. As I closed the fridge and turned around to face the desk, I saw directly out the window 2 very, very faint lights. I didn't even catch on and immediately started walking back to the desk fixated on the small glowing balls, and it wasn't until I had my nose almost pressed against the glass that I realized the 2 lights weren't lights at all. They were eyes. A set of eyes, sitting just above the fence line staring wide open at me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. My entire body locked up. All I could do was simply stare back as my brain was still comprehending that there was an actual person looking at me in the scariest way I could possibly ever imagine. I don't know what happened, either my head kicked into gear or my muscles loosened, but my body automatically collapsed and I fell to the floor, scurrying to hide against the wall away from the window. I could hear my heart beating through the carpet like a drum as I tried to lay as flat as possible, and as my mind was still processing the sheer severity of the situation, a violin started playing. That fucking violin and the haunting tune it always emitted started up, except this time it was directly outside my window and much louder than I'd ever heard it before. The lights were still off and I wanted to get up to turn off the PC screen so I couldn't be seen, but my whole body just wasn't ready to cooperate. Not only was the sound of the instrument extraordinarily loud, but it sounded like it was being played with frustration, notes being missed frequently and the strings screeching. The pace of it was getting faster and faster, and by this time, my dog Jeb out in the backyard had picked up on the situation and, registering an unfamiliar sound, gave one solitary, deep bark. The violin instantly stopped and the house was finally dead silent, excluding my headphones, which I could hear quietly working away. I was still frozen to the carpet, and it wasn't until Jeb gave a second menacing bark that I heard the figure outside the window start to walk away in the direction of my yard. Once that first footstep hit the ground, I instantly thought of the welfare of my best mate, and finally, my head connected with my extremities and my entire body kicked into overdrive. I leapt from the ground and slid across the laminated floor to the back door where Jeb was standing, staring into the backyard. I ducked to keep low and quietly unlocked and slid open the door. Usually doing so would notify Jeb that he was allowed inside, but when the door opened up, he didn't move an inch and was completely fixated on the pitch-black backyard. Everything told me not to go outside, but there was no chance I was letting anything happen to my dog, and I moved out onto the alfresco, moved behind Jeb, put my hand under his collar and attempted to back him toward the house. Jeb is a pure Labrador and weighs like a sack of sand, so when he doesn't want to move, it takes a sheer force to pull him in the direction you want him to go, and right now, Jeb wasn't going anywhere. I yanked at his scruff, and as I did, he emitted a bark like I'd never heard before, a deep, bellowing, "fuck you right off" sound that elevated my nerves to an all-time high. We both just stood there, waiting for some form of reply, and I couldn't remember how long we both just froze there, but eventually I heard footsteps from around the side of the house begin to walk away. But not a simple walk, almost like whoever was doing it was slowly dancing in a circle, the footsteps keeping to a beat as they drifted away from the house into the distance. Once I couldn't hear anything, Jeb licked his lips, gave me a look and wandered back inside. I followed, locked the door behind me, and spent the night reverting to my childlike self, hiding under my bed covers with my dog. I didn't sleep a wink. That was the last time I ever saw or heard the violin player. The following morning when the sun finally came up, I called into work sick and called the police. They scoured the lot next to mine and found footprints in the dirt. However, there were so many there that it was impossible to tell who was who. The only description I could give to the officer was his height. He would have had to be over 6 feet to stare over that fence at me, but they explained that he could have been standing on something or on his toes. They also told me that they've never received a report of anyone playing a violin in the area or anyone being on the fenced-off hill either. I essentially looked like an insane person, but the officers were very nice about the whole thing and offered to patrol the area for the next few nights, which helped put my mind at ease. Nothing else has happened since then. Over the next year or two, people finally started moving in and I told them all the stories about the figures I saw, some of which I still use to keep their children in line, which I found funny. One guy nicknamed the council lot Violin Hill, and the name has stuck around our street since then. I even spent a period of time scoring the depths of the internet for that violin tune I kept hearing, but could never find it. There were a few classical pieces that seemed reminiscent, but I've since thought that whatever tune was played must have been self-composed, which creeps me out even more. I'm still in the house, I still tell people the story, and I haven't changed my routine one bit, which has really helped me to block out the fear of the experience. I game with the blinds closed now.